Picture this. You're standing on an icy ridge, staring straight down. Strapped to your boots are rough wooden boards studded with rusty iron spikes. Crude, improvised crampons. They bite into the frozen earth and lock you in place. Below you, nearly 9,000 of Europe's finest knights are sliding helplessly on the ice. Their horses panic. Their steel boots find no grip. They came carrying expensive ropes to hang you. You brought cheap boulders to crush them. In just a few minutes, the old world order is about to be smashed apart by gravity and stone. This is the Battle of Morgarten. And this is how a group of farmers executed one of the most perfect ambushes in military history. Before we dive into this forgotten story of survival and slaughter, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider hitting like and subscribing for more content like this, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. It's honestly wild that we can explore these ancient moments together, scattered across the world, but connected by the same curiosity about the past. The date is November 15th, 1315. The location is a frozen nightmare along the edge of Lake Agary. The terrain here forms a natural guillotine. On the left, the black, icy water of the lake. On the right, steep forested slopes rising into the Morgarten Mountains. Between them, a muddy track barely wide enough for two horses to pass. And Duke Leopold I of the House of Habsburg has marched his army straight into this throat. He isn't worried about tactics. To him, this isn't a war. It's a hunting trip. A punitive expedition meant to discipline some rebellious peasants hiding in the forest cantons. His column stretches for miles, a glittering ribbon of steel, silk, and heraldry. The knights are loud, they're confident, they're laughing, and they are completely blind to the 1,500 men holding their breath in the tree line above. The Swiss Confederates don't issue a challenge. They don't wave banners. They don't announce themselves. They simply cut the ropes. It starts with a low rumble that you feel through your boots. High above the road, massive tree trunks, stripped of branches and stacked like siege engines, begin to slide. Then they fall. They thunder down the slope, snapping saplings like matchsticks, gaining speed with every rotation. When they hit the packed Habsburg column, the impact is catastrophic. The logs slam into the center of the formation and shatter it instantly. Horses rear and scream, slipping on the frozen road and throwing their riders. Armored men crash onto the ice, unable to stand, crushed beneath hooves or pinned under wreckage. The column is cut clean in half. The vanguard can't move forward. The road is blocked by a wall of debris. The rear can't retreat. Thousands of men are still pressing forward, unaware of the disaster ahead. Chaos rains down. Then the stones follow. Boulders the size of wine barrels bounce off the cliff face, punching through shields and crumpling helmets like parchment. The screams of men and horses swallow the shouted orders of commanders. The invincible heavy cavalry has become a trapped mob in a frozen bowling alley. And then the Swiss attack. They don't march. They sprint. Sliding down the icy slopes on their spiked boards, they hit the disorganized Austrians with terrifying momentum. While the knights flail like newborn deer on ice, the Swiss crash into them with the force of a landslide. This isn't a battle. It's an execution. The Swiss aren't looking for surrender. They carry halberds and morning stars, tools designed not to duel, but to destroy armor and shatter bone. A knight struggles to his knees, raising a hand to yield, expecting the civilized custom of ransom. A Swiss farmer answers by driving an axe through his visor. Blood sprays across the snow. At the edges of the road, knights are shoved backward by the crush and tumble into Lake Agary. The water churns as hundreds of men, each weighed down by 60 pounds of plate and mail, sink into the black depths. They don't even get to fight. They just drown, watching the surface vanish above them. In less than an hour, the myth of knightly superiority is shattered. The Swiss have turned terrain into a weapon and are dismantling the Habsburg army piece by bloody piece. But to understand why these farmers were angry enough to massacre the nobility, and why Leopold was arrogant enough to walk into this trap, we need to understand the men who thought they owned the world. To grasp the scale of this disaster, we leave the blood-soaked snow of Morgarten and step into the marble halls of Vienna. The House of Habsburg wasn't just another noble family, it was a geopolitical inevitability. By the early 14th century, the dynasty was spreading its tentacles across Central Europe. Austria, Styria, vast swaths of what's now Germany, all under Habsburg control. They were the too-big-to-fail institution of the Middle Ages. Their power was backed by God, gold, and the heaviest cavalry in Christendom. And at the center of this catastrophe stands Duke Leopold I. He's 25 years old, the younger brother of Frederick the Fair, King of Germany. Leopold is the archetype of the high medieval aristocrat, ambitious, impeccably bred, and dangerously overconfident. Chroniclers describe him as a man of action, desperate to prove himself outside his brother's shadow. He owns the finest armor money can buy, and commands knights who've trained for war since childhood. But Leopold suffers from a fatal blind spot, a condition shared by superpowers throughout history. He cannot imagine that a weaker enemy might fight back. When Leopold looks at the forest cantons, Uri, Schwyz, and Unalden, he doesn't see sovereign communities. He sees a property dispute. Yes, the peasants hold imperial charters granting them freedom. But to the Habsburgs, those documents are clerical errors waiting to be corrected. To Leopold, the Swiss aren't soldiers. They're rebellious tenants behind on their rent. That assumption shapes everything. When the Habsburg army assembles in the town of Zoo in November 1315, the mood is festive. Knights buckle polished plate and mail. Squires rush to shine shields painted with lions and eagles. This isn't treated like a march into hostile territory. It's a pageant. Look closely at what they bring. The baggage train is loaded with wine, fine clothes, extra horses, and bundles of rope. Not for climbing, for hangings. Leopold plans to capture the ringleaders, execute them publicly, restore order, and be home in a warm castle by Christmas. He brings no mountain guides, no serious scouting network. Why would he? You don't scout cattle. On November 14th, Leopold rides out of Zoo at the head of the Golden Column. His banners snap in the wind. His armor gleams. He believes he's riding toward a trophy ceremony. He has no idea he's leading a funeral procession for the feudal age. But the Swiss didn't just wake up one morning and decide to fight the emperor's brother. This collision had been building for years, sparked by an incident that looks less like a political dispute and more like something ripped from a Viking saga. History is rarely clean, and while it's tempting to cast the Swiss purely as innocent freedom fighters, the truth is darker. The spark that lit the bonfire of Morgarten wasn't a noble declaration of independence. It was a drunken, sacrilegious raid on a monastery. For generations, the people of Schwyz, one of the 3 forest cantons, had been locked in a bitter feud with the monks of the Einsiedeln Abbey. The conflict was known as the Marchen Streit, or the March Quarrel. At its core, it was about survival economics. In the Alps, flat land is gold. Pastures mean cattle, forests mean timber, and both the peasants and the monks claimed the same ground. tensions simmered for decades. The abbot, backed by the Habsburgs, accused the peasants of stealing timber. The peasants claimed the land had been theirs long before monks arrived with quill pens and deeds. Then, on the freezing night of January 6th, 1314, Epiphany night, the pot boiled over. Led by their landowman, Werner Stauffacher, a group of hot-headed men from Schwyz decided they were done with threats. They didn't send a petition. They launched an invasion. They stormed Einsiedeln Abbey. This was no symbolic protest. Doors were smashed in. Cellars were looted. The monks' sacramental wine was drunk until the raiders were roaring drunk. Relics were destroyed. Altars desecrated. The cloisters turned into a riot. And then they crossed the point of no return. They dragged the monks out into the snow and took them hostage. In the 14th century, attacking a monastery wasn't just a crime. It was an attack on God. The retaliation was swift and absolute. At the urging of the Habsburgs, the Bishop of Constance placed the entire canton of Schwyz under interdict. This was the nuclear weapon of medieval Christianity. No masses, no baptisms, no weddings, and worst of all, no burials in consecrated ground. To a deeply religious society, this meant spiritual death, damnation, an eternity locked out of heaven. When Uri and Unaldon refused to abandon Schwyz, the interdict was extended to them as well. And in that moment, the Swiss Confederation was forged. They became outlaws, not just politically, but spiritually, excommunicated, branded enemies of both empire and church. This context explains the savagery at Morgarten. When Leopold marched south a year later, he wasn't just collecting taxes. He was coming to execute heretics, and the Swiss understood something crucial. Surrender was impossible. You cannot negotiate with an enemy who believes you serve the devil. The raid on Einsiedeln burned the last bridge back to compromise. With their backs against the wall, the forest cantons renewed their oath. They would stand together, or die together. So when scouts reported that the Habsburg army was gathering at Zoo, the Swiss didn't panic. They mobilized. They were outnumbered nearly 6-1. They couldn't win a fair fight, so they didn't plan one. They needed a miracle, or more precisely, they needed a mistake. And Leopold was about to give them a colossal one. On the morning of November 15th, the Habsburg war machine rolled south out of Zoo. It was a spectacle designed to inspire awe. Sunlight flashed off thousands of helmets. Mail clinked rhythmically. War horses snorted clouds of steam into the cold air. At the front rode the heavy cavalry, the tanks of the medieval world. Counts, barons, and knights from across Habsburg lands, shields emblazoned with ancient heraldry. They rode knee to knee, joking, already discussing winter feasts once this peasant nuisance was dealt with. Behind them came the infantry, crossbowmen, servants, and finally the slow, sprawling baggage train. The column stretched nearly 3 miles, but as they moved along the shores of Lake Agari, the land began to close in. The open plains vanished. The road narrowed into a muddy, frozen track. On the right, the dark water of the lake lapped at the shore. On the left, the ground rose sharply into steep, wooded slopes. The formation compressed. What had been a wall of steel thinned into a fragile thread. In places, knights were forced to ride single file. This is every commander's nightmare. The bottleneck. In this formation, an army of 9,000 becomes an army of 1. If the man at the front stops, everyone stops. If he's attacked, the thousands behind him are helpless. Leopold pressed on. He was blinded by the assumptions of chivalric warfare. In his mind, the Swiss would form a proper shield wall in an open field. where his knights could lower their lances and ride them down like wheat. The idea that the enemy might refuse to play by the rules never occurred to him. There's a legend in Swiss folklore about a warning given that night. Some say a local noble sympathetic to the Swiss fired an arrow into camp with a message reading, "Watch out at Morgarten." Others claim Leopold himself was warned that the pass was a death trap. If the warning was given, it was ignored. By mid-morning, the vanguard had pushed deep into the narrow defile between mountain and lake. The ground was frozen hard, slick as glass. Horses struggled for footing. Laughter faded, replaced by heavy breathing and creaking leather. Then the shadow of the mountain swallowed the road. The golden column entered twilight. They were now fully inside the kill zone. Above them, hidden behind fir branches and snowbanks, the men of Schwyz watched. They saw the plumes on the helmets. They heard the voices of the men they were about to kill. They waited until retreat was physically impossible. Leopold rode near the front, surrounded by his guard, arguably the most powerful man in the region. At this exact moment, he was also the most vulnerable. Then the mountain moved. The attack began not with a shout, but with the groan of timber. High above, Swiss hands cut the ropes, stripped tree trunks, stacked into unstable pyramids, surrendered to gravity. They rolled, bounced, and tore down the slope, accelerating into unstoppable battering rams. The impact was seismic. Logs smashed into the heart of the column like a train wreck. Horses were swept off their feet. Men were crushed inside their armor before they even understood what was happening. The disciplined formation disintegrated in seconds, replaced by a screaming tangle of steel, flesh, and blood. Then came the stones. The Swiss unleashed tons of rock from the ridge. Plate armor, a marvel against blades, failed completely against raw physics. A falling boulder didn't need to pierce steel, it just caved it in. Breastplates crushed ribs, helmets collapsed skulls. Knights weren't being stabbed, they were being beaten to death by the landscape itself. And as the column buckled and compressed, the trap snapped shut. The Golden Army was now a stationary target. And that's when the Swiss descended. The Swiss didn't stay on the ridge. They drew their weapons and slid down the frozen slopes, moving with terrifying speed on their spiked boards. They poured into the kill zone like wolves dropping into a pen of trapped livestock. The knights looked up, dazed and concussed, and saw bearded men rushing toward them through the fog and snow. These attackers didn't carry elegant swords or lances. They carried tools that looked more at home in a slaughterhouse. And among them was a weapon about to change warfare forever. To understand why Morgarten shattered the medieval world, we need to zoom in. Forget the army. Focus on one man. Imagine a knight near the center of the crush. We'll call him Count Wilhelm. He's a tournament veteran, encased in a fortune's worth of Milan steel. He's shouting at his squire, trying to turn his terrified horse in the bloody slush. In any normal battle, Wilhelm is untouchable. His armor shrugs off sword blows. His height in the saddle makes him a god of war. Then a man steps out of the fog. He isn't armored. He's wearing a rough wool tunic and spiked boards strapped to his boots. In his hands is a 6-foot pole topped with an ugly, asymmetrical piece of iron. This is the halberd. Wilhelm draws his sword, confident. He has reach. He has steel. What he doesn't understand is physics. The Swiss farmer doesn't aim for Wilhelm. He swings at the horse. The axe blade shears through tendons. The horse collapses, screaming. Wilhelm is hurled into the mud, stunned, trapped under 60 pounds of metal. As he struggles to rise, slipping on ice, The genius of the halberd reveals itself. The farmer doesn't swing again. He uses the hook. He catches the rim of Wilhelm's shield, or the gap behind his knee, and yanks. The leverage of the long pole multiplies the force. Wilhelm is slammed face down into the filth. Now the kill. The farmer reverses his grip and brings the weapon down like a wood splitter. The axe crashes into the back of Wilhelm's helmet. The steel doesn't split, but the shock scrambles his brain. Finally, the spike. The farmer finds a gap, under the arm, at the groin, through the visor, and drives the point home with his body weight. Count Wilhelm, a lord of the realm, is dead, killed by a dairy farmer wielding a glorified tree pruner. This scene repeated itself hundreds of times in less than an hour. The halberd was the perfect answer to the knight. It gave infantry the reach to engage cavalry, the leverage to drag them down, and the piercing power to finish them. It turned armor from protection into a coffin. Once you were on the ground, armor wasn't safety. It was a cage. Trapped in the crush, Austrian knights watched in horror as comrades were hooked and dragged from their saddles like fish. There was no room to charge, no room to maneuver. Only the rhythmic thud of halberds rising and falling, cracking open the Habsburg elite like tin cans. This wasn't just a defeat. It was a technological revolution written in blood. The age of the invincible mounted knight ended on a muddy road in Switzerland, at the end of a 6-foot pole. As the shock of the ambush set in, surviving Austrians tried to do what noblemen always did when a battle turned bad. They tried to surrender. In 1315, war between aristocrats was a business. A trapped knight would raise his visor, drop his sword, shout his name, and offer ransom. Gold, rings, future payment. It was a gentleman's agreement. Morgarten shredded that agreement. When knights raised their hands in surrender, they were met with blank stares. The Swiss didn't speak the language of aristocracy. They had no dungeons, no spare food, no reason to care about lineage. They didn't see bags of gold. They saw men who had come to burn their homes. Chronicles describe scenes of horror. Knights screaming promises of wealth, holding out jeweled daggers. The Swiss answered with halberds. Men were cut down on their knees, no pauses, no mercy. Just iron on flesh until nothing moved. This sent shockwaves across Europe. To royal courts, this wasn't war. It was a crime against the natural order. The sheep hadn't just killed the wolves, they'd done it without respecting the food chain. But the Swiss logic was cold and simple. If these men lived, they would return next year with a bigger army. The message had to be absolute. The cost of invasion had to be unbearable. As panic turned to hysteria, Austrian soldiers realized armor and noble birth meant nothing. If surrender was death and fighting was death, only one option remained: escape. But the road was blocked. The mountain was impassable. That left the lake. Driven by the relentless pressure, hundreds of knights were pushed into Lake Agari. In summer, a swim might save you. In November, the water stole your breath instantly. And then there was the weight. 60 to 80 pounds of armor turns a man into an anchor. Knights didn't swim, they sank. Chronicles describe the surface churning with wounded horses and drowning men, fingers frozen as they fumbled with buckles meant to be removed by squires. Bubbles rose, then silence. The elite of Austria drowned a few yards from shore. Duke Leopold survived. But the man who rode out of Zoo that morning was gone. Accounts describe him fleeing pale and shaking, weeping with rage and terror, abandoning his army to escape. By early afternoon, the screaming stopped. The The pass was a ruin of broken wagons, dead horses, and nearly 2,000 Habsburg bodies. The snow was churned into red slush, the lake stained pink along the shore. Swiss losses? Around 12 men. Not 1,200. 12. The survivors who limped home carried more than wounds. They carried fear. Stories of forest devils who ignored rank, armor, and God. The myth of Habsburg invincibility lay at the bottom of the lake. For the Swiss, this victory changed everything. They stripped the dead, funding their future. And word spread fast. Europe didn't just fear these mountain men. It wanted to hire them. This was the birth of Switzerland's first great export. Mercenaries. Before banks, before watches, before chocolate. Violence. Swiss soldiers became the most sought-after fighters in Europe. Disciplined infantry, masters of terrain, infamous for giving no quarter. They refined their tactics, adopting the pike, creating impenetrable formations. But their true weapon was psychological. Hire the Swiss, and the enemy knew surrender meant nothing. No money, no Swiss became gospel. For 2 centuries, they dominated battlefields. Even the Pope decided the only men he trusted with his life were these mountain warriors. The Swiss Guard still stands today, halberds in hand, a living echo of Morgarten. Eventually, gunpowder ended their dominance, but the idea born there survived. Armed neutrality, fierce independence. If you visit Lake Agary today, it's peaceful. A quiet road, a simple stone marker. But beneath the silence lies a moment that overturned the medieval world. Morgarten proved that titles mean nothing to physics, that terrain is a weapon, and that free men defending their own soil are the most dangerous soldiers on earth. Those knights rode into the pass, believing birth entitled them to victory. They died learning that war respects only leverage, preparation, and the will to kill. The snow-covered mountains of Switzerland look peaceful now. But that peace was bought in frozen mud, with blood, stone, and the swing of a halberd.